This whole week at work had been tough. To make things worse, my boss, the company's president, called me into his office and scolded me for a mistake made by someone else. When I got home, I found my sister-in-law's car blocking my driveway. I couldn't even park in front of my house because the neighbor's teenage son had friends over and cars filled the street. I ended up having to park 3 houses down. I wasn't even sure why I was going into the house. My wife's sister, Susan, and I had never gotten along since the first day we met. For some reason, she seemed to dislike me right away, and I didn't think I would have much luck with my wife, Janice, that night either. We hadn't been close in almost a month, despite my efforts. As I walked toward my driveway, I noticed an empty garbage can by the curb. I dragged it around the side of the house and set it next to the back door before stepping inside the kitchen. Music was playing in the living room, and I could hear my wife and her sister chatting. I opened the refrigerator and grabbed a beer. After popping the top, I took a long drink before heading to the living room. Just as I reached the door, I heard something that made me stop. God, he was with me 3 times today. That wasn't Susan's voice. It was Janice's. Ever since Brandon came back last month, I just can't get enough of him, she continued. I had never met Brandon, but I knew he was my wife's ex-boyfriend who had moved away after they broke up. What are you going to do now? Asked Susan. Brandon wants me to move in with him, so I'll be getting a lawyer to file for divorce, Janice replied. Since we live in a community property state, I'll get half of everything. That was more than I could take. I turned around and walked back to my car, sitting in the driver's seat. It hit me then why Janice and I had been distant. She was with someone else, and now she wanted half of everything we had. The hardest part was knowing the state would allow it. Janice and I had been married for just 3 years. After our wedding, she quit her job. While she was home, she rarely helped with anything. I even hired a maid to clean the house and do laundry 3 times a week, and she would cook dinner on those days. The rest of the time, I either cooked or we ordered takeout. I know what you're thinking, but I was in love and didn't see the signs. She had kept me happy until a month ago. My mother passed away when I was 13, which left both my father and me heartbroken. She had been the center of our world. It was hard at first, but eventually we learned to move forward. Dad did his best to raise me right, and I think he succeeded. I was very close to him, so it was a huge shock when I lost him because of an irresponsible driver. This happened when I was 23, just a year before I met Janice. Dad left everything to me. I inherited almost $2.5 million. It was a lot of money, but not as much as some people have today. I had never spent the money, choosing to keep it invested. With help from a good broker, I was able to make my savings grow, even in the current economy. I earned enough that I didn't need to touch the money. Despite Janice trying to spend what I made, I still had another $100,000 saved up. I loved Janice, and we didn't have a prenuptial agreement. Like many people, I mistakenly believed my marriage would last forever. That mistake meant she could take almost $1.5 million from me. And for what? I was angry that she could benefit from the situation. She had mentioned getting a lawyer, which meant she wasn't ready to take action yet. I still had time to think. While I sat in my car, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror until I saw my sister-in-law's car back out and leave. I started my car and did a quick turn to go back home. When I walked into the house, Janice was nowhere to be seen, so I went to the kitchen for another beer. I opened the can and took a long drink. "Oh, there you are, honey," Janice said, entering the kitchen. "I didn't hear you come in." "Hello, dear, just got home. It's been a long day," I replied, trying to keep a smile on my face. I wanted to show her I could act, too. "I didn't have time to order anything for dinner," she said with a little pout. What I wanted to say was, "That's because you were busy with someone else," but instead I said, "That's okay, sweetie. I'll just heat up some leftovers from last night." Janice smiled and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. "I'm going to go soak in a hot bath," she said. I smiled and nodded. After she left, I warmed up some fried rice and ate it cold while finishing 2 more beers. I threw the empty container in the trash and headed to the den to relax in my recliner. After flipping through 30 channels, I settled on an old John Wayne movie. About half an hour later, Janice returned and sat on the couch until the movie ended. She stood up, said she was tired, and was going to bed. I sweetly told her I would watch the news and then come up. I hadn't really focused on the movie. My mind was busy thinking about what I should do next. I realized there was nothing I could do until Monday morning, so I had to get through the next few days. On Saturday, I worked in the yard, and on Sunday, I played golf with a couple of friends who I would really miss. On Monday, I contacted my broker who managed my inheritance and asked him to sell everything. One good thing about my job was that I could access my retirement fund fast. Forget about the penalties. By Thursday, I was ready to take action. I went home to my wife and told her there was an urgent matter and I would be flying out tomorrow for work and might be gone for a week. I packed 2 suitcases, that was all I would take. When we moved into our house, I had put my important things into storage because they didn't match her style, so there wasn't much left that I wanted. She had chosen the furniture and I didn't care about it. One positive aspect was that we were renting the house, so I had no money invested in it. I had recently sold my condo, and we were on the lookout for the perfect house. By perfect, I meant the kind she liked. So far, the houses we had seen just didn't meet her expectations. On Friday morning, I gave my wife a kiss on the cheek one last time and took my suitcases out the door. I loaded them into my car and drove away without looking back. My first stop was to see an old friend, Jake, whom I trusted completely. He was surprised when I told him I wanted to trade titles for his older 4-wheel drive. I shared my plans with him, and an hour later I was on my way west. I doubted anyone would connect me to this vehicle, and Jake agreed to keep my old car out of sight for a while. For the next 4 days, I paid in cash everywhere I went. I had canceled all our credit cards and wanted to avoid leaving any traces. The majority of my money was now safely stored in an offshore account with my broker's help. I had arranged a system with him to transfer funds when needed. I also had enough cash hidden in the SUV to last me for a while. Spending nights alone in motels was the hardest part. For the past week, I had been too busy with my plans to think much about what had happened to me personally. I had loved Janice. I wouldn't have married her otherwise. I played out different scenarios in my mind, but in the end, I decided there wasn't much I could have done differently. Even if I had known her old boyfriend had come back, I don't think I could have separated them. I came to 2 conclusions. First, I don't think she ever truly loved me. I was just a means for her. Second, it was my mistake to have married her. Now, on my 5th day away from home, I sat in a small diner in Montana. I was thinking about what my caring wife was doing. By now, she must have realized that all her credit cards were canceled, and there was no money in our bank account. My thoughts were interrupted by an older couple at the next table. Even though they spoke softly, I could still hear their conversation. The man was telling his wife that he wished he could take on another project. The problem was that they couldn't afford to hire help until their calves were ready for market, and even then they had trouble finding anyone willing to work for what they could pay. I guessed the man was in his late 50s. His hair was mostly gray, but you could tell it used to be dark. His wife had striking red hair and clear blue eyes. I finished my meal, stood up, and approached their table. "I'm sorry for listening in, but maybe I can help you," I said. The older man looked me over. "I don't see how you could do that. You know I can't pay you anything." "What if I just need a place to stay in exchange for my work?" I replied. His eyes narrowed. "Colleen, excuse us for a moment while I talk to this young man outside," he said, standing up and waiting for me to follow him. Once we were in the parking lot where it was quiet, he turned to me. He was about my height of 6 feet, broad-shouldered, and appeared fit. His face was rugged, with signs of years spent outdoors, and his dark brown eyes looked straight at me with intensity. "Who are you? Are you part of that Wilson group?" he asked sharply. I raised my hands in a calming gesture. "Hold on, mister. I don't know anything about any Wilsons. 4 days ago I was in Texas and I just got here this morning. I thought we could help each other. If what you're saying is true, why would you want to help us? I can't pay you. What's in it for you? If you're running from the law, we don't need that kind of trouble." "I might be trying to avoid some issues, but not in the way you think," I explained. I then shared my story about my wife wanting to take everything from me and how I needed a place to stay for a while. "I haven't harmed anyone. I just want to keep what's mine. If you have space, I could help you out with my work. I'll pay my way, and if you think I'm not helpful, just say so and I'll leave with no hard feelings." He examined my face closely. "If what you're saying is true, it would be foolish of me not to at least give you a chance. I need to tell you that the Wilsons are trying to get me to sell my land to them. They haven't done anything sneaky yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. You might be taking on more than you can handle." I told him I was ready to take that chance. He asked if I had ever worked on a ranch before. I was honest and mentioned I had spent a few summers at my uncle's place in Texas, but I wasn't really a cowboy. He extended his hand and we shook on our agreement. He asked me to call him Bill, and I introduced myself. We went back into the diner where his wife was waiting. "Colleen, this is Carson Jones. He's going to work for us if he can manage," Bill said. Colleen stood up and reached out her hand. I shook it. "It's very nice to meet you, Carson," she said. Her voice was clear with a hint of an Irish accent. Like her husband, she looked fit and healthy. She was quite a beautiful woman. "It's nice to meet you too, Mrs." I realized Bill hadn't told me her last name. "Buckman. My last name is Buckman, but you can just call me Colleen. We don't really use formalities here." I immediately liked this warm lady. Bill mentioned that I could follow them back to the ranch. Before leaving town, he stopped at a general store and I got out to join him. "I thought you might want to get some clothes for ranch work," he said. "Yeah, you're right. I don't think what I brought will last long," I replied, thankful for his thoughtfulness. I followed him inside, where the store owner greeted him warmly. It was clear that Bill was a regular. After about 40 minutes, I had bought enough jeans and work shirts for the week, plus a coat and a pair of Western-style riding boots. It would be enough for now. From the general store, it was about a 25-mile drive to the main gate, which had an arch over it with the name Rocking Bee Ranch. That was his brand, a rocking bee. Another mile down a private road led to the main house. Their 2-story home sat on a hill, looking well-kept and freshly painted. Behind the house, I could see a barn and several other buildings. The truck they drove was partly loaded with bags of groceries, and I figured this was their weekly trip for supplies. I parked behind them, grabbed some bags, and followed the Buckmans into the kitchen. After 2 trips, we had unloaded everything. Bill told me to drive around back and he would show me where I could stay. I circled around and saw him in front of a small cabin. When I got out, he told me I could use this cabin and pointed to a similar one nearby that was used by Sam. He mentioned that Sam was out checking the ranch and I would meet him later. Bill waited while I unloaded my bags. The cabin had one big room with a bed along one wall and a table with 2 chairs. In one corner was a wood stove, and there was also a bathroom with a shower. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean. It would work for now as a good place to stay and hopefully stay out of Janice's way. When I went back outside, Bill was waiting in his truck and asked me to get in. He drove me around the ranch. He had almost 6,000 acres, with 5,000 being mostly flat and good for grazing. A couple hundred acres were used for growing winter feed. The back part of the ranch was hilly and had a lot of trees. I could see some mountains in the distance, and a stream ran through the property. He mentioned that part could only be accessed on horseback. I found out that he used to have 3 full-time workers, but times had been tough, and now Sam was the only one left. Sam had been working on the ranch for nearly 30 years. He would hire extra help during times when they rounded up the animals to sell. It was 5 o'clock when Bill dropped me off at the small cabin. "Oh, by the way, I saw you have a laptop. I have a satellite connection with a router so you can get the internet wirelessly. Dinner is in the main house, and we usually eat at 6, he said before leaving. It took me less than 30 minutes to unpack my things. Then I had time to turn on my computer. Just as Bill said, I could connect to the internet. I quickly checked my email. I had set up a new account, and there was one message from Jake. He mentioned that if he heard anything about Janice, he would let me know. Apparently, she had reported me missing to the police, and they were looking into my disappearance. That was something to think about. Jake was the only person I had told I was leaving, and even he didn't know where I was going, as I hadn't decided yet. I had mailed my resignation to my old job, but hadn't told them in person. Just before 6, I walked over to the main house and knocked on the kitchen door. Bill called for me to come in. I stepped inside and saw Colleen putting food on the table. Bill was talking to a man I assumed was Sam. Bill waved me over. "Sam, this is Carson, the new hand I told you about. At least, for today. We'll see how he feels about it tomorrow after a day's work," Bill said with a big smile. "Carson, this is Sam." Sam greeted me warmly and offered his hand. He was a tall man, at least 6'3", and like Bill, looked like he had worked hard all his life. He appeared to be about the same age as Bill. I shook his hand and felt how strong he was. "Well, I hope you like it here. I could use the help," he said. At 28, I was about half his age, so he considered me young. I planned to give it my best shot, I replied. Just then, Colleen told us to sit down because dinner was ready. Bill and his wife sat at opposite ends of the table, leaving Sam and me to sit across from each other in between them. The table was filled with a big platter of pork chops, a bowl of mashed potatoes, and another bowl of fresh green beans. There were also homemade biscuits piled high on a plate. "We don't eat fancy here, Carson," Colleen said, "but there's plenty of food and it's filling." I could not help but drool a little. "It looks great," I replied. The food went around and we filled our plates. It looked and tasted wonderful. Colleen was a skilled cook. While we ate, I asked Bill if he had lived here his whole life. "Yep. My grandfather started this ranch and passed it on to my dad. Now it belongs to me and Colleen." Bill paused, thinking. "When I was younger, I wasn't sure if she would be a part of it. I had to fight off every man in 3 counties to win her over." Bill looked at Colleen, and I saw the love he had for her in his gaze. "Now, Bill, you know you're the only man I've ever wanted. I just needed to be sure you wanted me enough," Colleen said. "My wife has given me the 3 happiest days of my life. The day she agreed to marry me, the day she became my wife, and the day she had our daughter, Caitlin," Bill said. I hadn't seen any sign of their daughter, and Colleen must have noticed my curiosity. "Our daughter is away right now. Caitlin is finishing her doctorate in veterinary sciences at South Dakota State. She only gets to come home during holidays, and we're waiting eagerly for her to return with her degree. She should be back in a couple of months," Colleen explained. "It'll be nice to have a vet in the family. That should help with some of the costs," Bill added with a smile. After dinner, I tried to help clean up, but Colleen insisted that it was her job and gently waved me away. Bill mentioned that breakfast was at 5:30 and we would start working at 6. As Sam and I were leaving, I noticed a copy of today's New York Times on the counter. Bill must have picked it up when he was in town. I asked if I could borrow the front page, and he agreed. Once outside, I asked Sam if he could come into my cabin for a moment. We stepped inside, and I showed him how to use my digital camera. I had him take a close-up picture of me holding the front page of the newspaper. I could see he was curious about the picture, but he did not ask. He did ask if I had an alarm clock, and I assured him I did. He said he would see me in the morning and left. I transferred the picture to my computer and emailed it with a note to the police in my old hometown, saying I was alive and had left town on my own. Using a local paper would have given a hint about my location, but this way I could be anywhere. I sent an email to Jake and asked him to go to a nearby coffee shop with free internet. I thought my work email would still be active, so I gave him my password. This way, he could send my original email and picture to the police without leaving any clues to find me or him. I hoped that the police would not consider me a missing person and would not spend too much time looking for someone who had run away. I had a peaceful sleep that night. The next morning, I woke up at 5, took a shower, and got dressed in time to walk with Sam to the main house for breakfast. We had eggs, sausage, hash browns, and toast, and there was enough for everyone. After breakfast, Bill told Sam to take me to replace some fence posts on a hilly part of the land. Sam led me to the barn and showed me a horse and a saddle I would need. He watched closely as I saddled a big brown mare. My past experience on my uncle's ranch helped, and Sam seemed pleased with my work. We then took 2 mules and loaded them with fence posts and a post hole digger. Bill came out carrying a rifle for safety, mentioning it was mainly in case there was an animal that needed help. Thankfully, that didn't happen often. Sam and I hopped on our horses, leading a mule each, and rode up the creek into the hills. As we rode, Sam and I talked and learned about each other. I shared how I ended up in Montana, feeling that he wouldn't betray me. He opened up about his past, mentioning that he had married right after high school, but found his ex-wife with another man. He got angry and ended up in prison for 5 years. After that, Bill was the only person willing to give him a job. He said he really respected Bill and Colleen, calling them wonderful people. The morning sun cast a beautiful light over the mountains behind us. It was early April, and while the snow had melted in the lower areas, some still covered the peaks. As we reached the trees, the trail climbed higher. After about 30 minutes, we came to the fence marking the property's edge. Sam pointed out that not all posts needed replacing, only the ones that were rotting or close to it, which was about every 3rd one. He stayed with me while I installed the first 2, making sure I was doing it correctly. Sam told me if I worked until 4, I would have enough time to care for the horse and mules before dinner at 6. He reminded me to follow the stream back down so I wouldn't get lost. With Sam gone, I focused on my work, and there was something calming about being in this beautiful, hilly, forested area. I worked my way along the fence, taking out the old posts and putting in new ones. At noon, I took a break and pulled out the pork chop sandwiches that Colleen had given me this morning. They were leftovers from last night's dinner and still tasted great. As I ate quietly, I noticed a blue jay flying through the trees. A woodpecker stopped briefly to peck at a tree in search of food. Then, a deer appeared on the other side of the fence. She carefully approached until she caught my scent. She snorted and quickly ran back into the trees, her tail waving behind her. After finishing my sandwiches, I returned to work. I had set an alarm on my watch, and it beeped at 4 that afternoon. I saw that I had set all but 2 of the posts the mules had brought up. Leading the mules, I walked back along the fence until I found the stream and went downhill. A little before I left the trees, I spotted a natural pool where the stream flowed in and out. I stopped to take in the view. The upper stream dropped over a 10-foot ledge, creating a waterfall into the clear water below. I knew this was one of the most beautiful and peaceful spots on the ranch. I got back to the barn just in time to unsaddle the animals and feed them. Sam came in to take care of his horse while I was there. When I told him I had set most of the posts, he seemed surprised and impressed. We had just enough time to clean up and change for dinner. That night we had steak. Bill looked pleased when Sam shared my progress with him. I was exhausted and did not say much during dinner. Once the meal was over, I excused myself and went straight to bed. I fell asleep quickly. When I woke up, I could feel the soreness in my body. My hands hurt from digging the post holes, as did my arms, shoulders, and legs. I thought I was in decent shape since I worked out regularly, but there is a big difference between a 2-hour workout and a full day of putting up fence posts. When I limped into the kitchen and winced while sitting down, both Bill and Sam chuckled. Even Colleen tried hard not to smile. I was really hungry, though, and enjoyed the food. "Ready for another day of fencing?" Bill asked as we got up from the table. I sighed. "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to sound more positive than I felt. Bill laughed again. "I think you should take it easy today. I'd like you to ride with Sam." I nodded, grateful for the change. The first task of the day was to clean out the stalls and put in fresh hay. We let the horses and mules into the pasture and filled their feeders. Only then did we load into the pickup truck to check the range. Basically, we were making sure there were no cows down or calves that had become separated from their mothers. The tour Sam took me on was much longer than the one I had with Bill on my first day at the ranch. Sam seemed to know just where the cattle would be and how many there were. After 30 years, it was second nature for him. We reached the end of the ranch, and Sam stopped the truck to look around. Something on one of the hills caught his eye, so he took out his binoculars and handed them to me, pointing to where I should focus. After a moment, I spotted 2 calves that looked like they were alone. "Where are their mothers?" I asked. Sam pointed to 2 cows by the trees. "Those are them. The calves must have wandered off into the trees and got lost. We need to bring them back down." "Are we hiking up there?" I questioned. "No, it's too far. We'll get some horses instead." Sam used the truck's radio to call Bill and let him know what we found and that we were on our way for the horses. When we got back to the barn, Bill had already saddled 2 horses and loaded them onto a trailer. All we had to do was hitch up and go. Sam drove us close to the edge of the trees below where the calves were, and we unloaded the horses, riding up into the hills. Sam knew this area well. Half an hour later, we quietly approached the calves and began to guide them back down. I couldn't help but laugh when the calves saw their mothers after we came out from the trees. They ran to their moms, calling out, and immediately looked to nurse. The bigger cows stood patiently while their young fed. I thought about how, if I had run off from my mom, I would have faced a stern talking to instead of being welcomed like that. That night for dinner, we enjoyed fried chicken, corn on the cob, and mashed potatoes. The platter was piled high with perfectly cooked pieces. I felt more energetic that night and chatted more than I had before. I learned about Colleen. Her parents had moved to the United States from Ireland when she was 5. Her father loved the stories of the Old West, which brought them to Montana. That explained the hint of an Irish accent in her speech. Though she grew up in America, her parents still influenced her words. The next day, I felt much better. After breakfast, I went back to replace fence posts. Sam helped me load the mules, but I set out on my own. I just needed to follow the stream to my destination. This day was easier than the first, as I had picked up a few tips to make the work lighter. Just before 4 o'clock, I set the last post and headed back to the barn. I had some spare time, so I cleaned out some of the stalls before getting ready for dinner. On my 4th day, I assisted Sam with repairs to some of the buildings, and the next day, I set more fence posts. The following 2 months went by quickly. I took my turn riding around the land to check on the cattle. I was feeling great. We had a schedule where Sam took Saturday off, Bill took Sunday off, and I took Monday off. On my day off, I did my laundry and went into town if I needed anything. I liked everyone on the ranch. Sam was friendly and easy to talk to. After dinner, we often sat and chatted. I respected Bill because he was honest and worked hard. We got along well. Colleen was very kind to both of us, but I could see she had a strong spirit. She and Bill made a nice couple. Colleen and Bill were getting excited. At breakfast on Friday, Colleen told me her daughter would be coming home in a week. That day, it was my turn to take a horse and ride through the woods to check for cattle that might have wandered into the hills. It was a little after 4 when I reached the stream and decided to follow it down. When I got to the pool below the waterfall, I stopped and got off my horse. I knelt next to the water and soaked my bandana in the cool water to clean my face and neck. I heard a horse from downstream and looked over to see someone approaching. At first, I thought it was Colleen, but then I quickly realized it was her daughter, Caitlin. She had the same bright blue eyes and red hair as her mother. She rode up and stopped a little distance away. I stood up, and she looked me over before her gaze landed on my bare chest, which showed the results of my hard work. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" she asked sharply. "My name's Carson, and I work here," I replied. "I don't believe you. My dad said he couldn't afford to hire anyone else," she said. Even though she was beautiful, her unfriendly tone annoyed me a bit. "Yeah, I heard that too. I guess that's why I find it funny every payday." Caitlin glared at me and turned her horse around quickly before riding away. I chuckled to myself, put my shirt back on, and got back on my horse to head towards the barn. Later, I found out that there had been a misunderstanding between Caitlin and her parents. They thought she was coming home next week. To their surprise, she had actually arrived a couple of hours after I had left. She spent the morning with them until she told them she wanted to ride, something she enjoyed but hadn't had time for at school. So she saddled up and went to her favorite spot by the waterfall. After 2 months, it seemed I wasn't as interesting anymore, and Bill and Colleen had forgotten to mention me to her. Just as I rounded the barn, I saw the back of the redhead disappear inside. I got down and led my horse inside. Caitlin was likely looking for her father and finally found him in the barn. I could hear her voice clearly. "Who was that man by the waterfall?" she asked. Bill thought for a moment. "That must have been Carson," he replied. "He said he works here, but last time I checked, you said you couldn't pay another worker." "Well, he does work here. As for his pay, I don't think that's something you need to worry about. I still own this ranch," he said. "Daddy, he says you pay him so well that he laughs all the way to the bank," she said. By that time, I had walked into the barn. Caitlin had her back to me and didn't see me. Bill did and smiled at me. "Is that true, Carson? If you think you're overpaid, I can fix that," he joked. Caitlin turned around and gave me a fierce look. I took off my hat and scratched my head. "Well, I wouldn't want to take advantage of you, Bill. How much are you planning to cut my pay?" I asked. Bill and I both laughed at that, but Caitlin didn't find it funny. "Just so you know, Caitlin, Carson stays in the cabin next to Sam's," Bill said. "And what else?" she pressed. "That, and he gets to enjoy your mother's wonderful cooking," he added. "So you aren't paying him? Why would he work for free?" Caitlin persisted. "He has his reasons, and it's not my place to share," Bill responded. "Working just for a chance to taste your mother's cooking is worth a lot. I don't think she would like to hear you say otherwise," I chimed in. Caitlin shot me another glare and left the barn in a huff. Bill shook his head. She reminds me so much of her mother when she was young. I never thought I could manage Colleen." At dinner that night, Caitlin joined us. She sat next to Sam on the opposite side of the table from me, giving me another sharp look when I entered the kitchen. I waited until everyone had their plates filled before speaking. "Your mother told me you finished your doctorate in veterinary medicine," I said in a friendly tone. "Yeah," was her brief response without looking up. "Sam mentioned there's only one other vet in the area and he's over 50 miles away. You'll be a great help to the people here," I said. Caitlin glanced up at my compliment, and I thought I saw her eyes soften slightly. "Yes, that would be Doc Harrison," Colleen added. "He has more clients than he can handle and is often needed in multiple places at the same time. I agree with you, Carson. Our Caitlin will provide excellent service." During the rest of the meal, Caitlin chatted with her parents and Sam, who had been on the ranch since before she was born. She didn't speak to me directly, and I mostly stayed quiet. This was her return home, and I knew her parents and Sam wanted to catch up on her life while she was away. After finishing my meal, I excused myself and went back to my cabin. I checked my email and saw one from Jake. He mentioned that he had spoken to a friend on the police force who said they no longer considered me a missing person after they received the photo I had sent. Jake also shared that Brandon had broken up with Janice as soon as he found out I had disappeared with the money, and it didn't seem like she would see any of it anytime soon. Janice couldn't afford the rent for the house we had shared and was now living in a rundown apartment while working as a waitress. She didn't have the money to hire a lawyer against me. I found it ironic that she had married me for my money, and her boyfriend had done the same. I was still replacing fence posts, but only worked on it every third or fourth day. I had moved from the hills to an area where I could drive my truck right to my work site. It was much easier to load the posts in the back of the truck than on the mules. The morning after Caitlin returned home, I loaded the truck with posts and drove to where I had left off. When lunchtime came, I started toward the truck, realizing I had forgotten my lunch. Colleen usually made sure we had lunch if we were working away from the main house, but I must have forgotten to grab mine. I could have driven back, but I decided one missed meal wouldn't hurt. About half an hour later, I had just set a pole and was attaching the wire when I heard a vehicle coming. I looked back and saw one of the ranch trucks. It stopped just as I finished. I turned around in surprise to see Caitlin get out, holding a small bag like the ones Colleen used for lunches. "Mama said you forgot your lunch," she said, handing the bag to me. I took it from her. "Thank you, Caitlin. That was very kind of you," I replied. I looked inside and found 2 sandwiches. I took one out and offered the other to Caitlin, but she shook her head. I shrugged and sat on the truck's tailgate to eat. Caitlin stood a few feet away, just watching me. I kept my gaze straight ahead. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. I turned to her and decided to tease a bit. "You can't tell anyone. I robbed a bank and hid the money. I'm staying here until things calm down so I can get the money." At first her eyes widened, but then she frowned at me. "You're a real fool," she said and turned to leave. I waited until she was halfway to her truck. "Caitlin." When she heard me say her name, she stopped and slowly turned around. "I married a woman who never cared for me and only wanted what I could give her. I ended up here because I just wanted to escape everything familiar for a while." Caitlin looked at me again, and I think she decided I was being honest this time. She nodded and left without saying anything more. As she drove away, I thought about what her dad told me about her mom being like Caitlin when she was younger. He mentioned he had settled her mom down, but I believed it was their love for each other that made the difference. It had been less than a day since I first met Caitlin, and I couldn't imagine any man settling down the spirited redhead. Dinner that night was similar to the night before. Caitlin talked with her parents and Sam. I didn't feel left out. She didn't know me, and we didn't really share anything in common. Just as we were finishing, there was a knock at the door, and Bill went to answer it. He came back into the kitchen with a man about my age. He was what you'd call tall, dark, and handsome. Caitlin happily called out a name and jumped from her chair to hug the guy. It was clear they knew each other. They chatted about how long it had been since they last saw each other. A few minutes later, there was another knock on the door, and Bill answered again, this time bringing in another man. This one had light hair but was also good-looking. He received a warm greeting from Caitlin, too. I remembered Bill's comments about how he had to keep away other guys to win his wife. Caitlin was every bit as beautiful as her mother had been, at least in looks. I excused myself from the table and went back to my cabin. I hoped those two guys had good luck. I couldn't help but feel a bit envious. If Caitlin turned out to be like her mother, whoever won her heart would be a fortunate man. The next day I took the truck and rode around the ranch. After checking everything, something didn't seem right. It was early enough that I went back to get Sam, and we took a quick tour of the ranch. There were many cattle scattered about, but he agreed that something felt off. It seemed like we were missing a few. We decided to saddle up the next day and check the hilly areas. We talked it over with Bill at dinner, and he agreed with our plan. It rained that night, making it harder to find tracks. The next morning, we loaded our horses into a trailer, and Bill drove us to one end of the property. I rode about a third of the way into the trees, and Sam rode another third higher. We made our way across the ranch, traveling over the hills and through the trees. It took most of the day to reach the other side. Along the way, we spotted 5 stray cattle. Bill was waiting for us when we came out of the hills. We loaded the horses into the trailer and headed back, discussing how we needed to be more alert about the situation. At dinner that night, Caitlin received another visitor. I heard her mother comment that it was the 3rd visitor that day. Word had spread that Caitlin was back home, and many young men were eager to get her attention. The next 4 days, we focused on watching the herd closely. Everything seemed fine except for the original loss of cattle. Caitlin's visitors kept coming, and despite being back for a week, she hadn't spoken much to me since the day she brought my lunch. On the 5th day after the cattle went missing, I told Bill I wanted to check the property line through the hills. We had already looked at all the fence lines in the pasture areas without finding any signs of the missing cattle. Sam dropped me off on the west side of the ranch where Bill's land met the Wilson Ranch. About halfway to the southwest corner, I noticed 3 fresh sets of horse tracks crossing from the Wilson side of the fence onto Bill's side. It was strange that the fence wire was still intact. I got off my horse and checked the fence posts, noticing that the staples were loose on 5 posts, barely holding the wire. If someone pulled out the staples and lowered the wire, it would be easy to cross. I got back on my horse and followed the tracks. As I approached a nearby stream, I saw 3 horses tied to a tree near a waterfall. I quickly tied my horse to a tree, took my rifle from its holder, and quietly moved through the trees, keeping a sharp lookout. When I reached the horses, I spotted boot prints heading downstream. I moved to the edge of the waterfall and gasped. There was Caitlin in the pool. I was taken aback. She was swimming in the water, and her presence caught me by surprise. A movement in the trees to her right brought me back to reality. I quickly looked around and saw 1 man to the right and 2 others coming toward the pond on the left. I raised my rifle and fired a shot, the bullet landing between the feet of the man on the right. A second shot made the ground kick up between the 2 men on the left. Caitlin screamed loudly, her voice echoing through the trees. I stood up, making sure everyone could see me. "Get down on the ground now! I won't miss this next shot," I called out. "Caitlin, stay where you are." Caitlin couldn't see the 3 men nearby. All she saw was me standing over her with a rifle. "Are you crazy, Carson?" she shouted. She was trying to cover herself as best she could. One of the men on the left looked like he might run. I pulled the trigger again, and the bark from the tree next to him burst apart. He dropped to the ground, scared. Caitlin turned to see where I shot and gasped. I said, "Lay on your stomachs. 3, 2. Before I could say 1, the other 2 dropped down. "Now put your faces in the dirt and your hands behind your heads." They obeyed. "Now get out, Caitlin, and get dressed." "But Carson," she started to protest. "Just do what I tell you. Get dressed and get out of here," I urged firmly. Caitlin looked frightened, and I could see her shaking from where I stood, but she followed my command and stepped out of the pool. She turned her back to me as she put on her jeans and shirt, then hopped on her horse. With 1 kick, she galloped away through the trees. Once she was gone, I told the men to come up the rise one at a time and lie back down. I breathed a sigh of relief when all 3 were in front of me. It was time for a bluff. "Now what am I going to do with you 3? I paused for effect. "Maybe I could just hurt you and watch you suffer." They began begging for mercy, and I could smell fear in the air as one of them seemed to lose control. "Even if I don't hurt you, Caitlin's father will when I tell him how you plan to harm his daughter. You might want to confess to the sheriff about something else, like rustling cattle. It might mean jail time, but at least you'd be alive." The smallest of the three cracked. "Yes, we did it. Wilson said if he could break Buckman, he could take his land." One of the others told him to be quiet. "Shut up! I'm not dying over some cattle," the smaller guy shot back. I knew Caitlin would ride fast to find her father, and soon he would come looking for answers. So I decided to wait. Sure enough, about 45 minutes later, both Bill and Sam rode into view. I waved to them and they rushed to the top of the waterfall. "What is going on?" Bill asked sharply from his horse, looking at the three men lying down. "Looks like some of Wilson's men decided to pay us a visit," I explained. I followed the footprints from the fence to this spot. Caitlin was swimming, and these three were trying to sneak up on her. I walked over to my captives and pushed the end of my rifle lightly against the smaller guy's neck. "I think this one has something to say." I nudged him again. "We did it. We took some of your cattle. But it was Wilson who made us do it," he cried out sadly. Bill adjusted his hat and smiled broadly. "You know, when my grandfather started this ranch, they used to just hang horse thieves and cattle rustlers. That seemed fair. It's a shame we have to be more civilized now." Sam watched the unexpected visitors while Bill and I spoke quietly. We decided to take them back with us. Bill and I followed behind them, rifles ready, while Sam secured their horses and brought up the rear. When we reached the barn, we put the rustlers in separate stalls and had them sit down. We could see them, but they couldn't see each other. Bill went inside the house to call the sheriff while Sam and I kept watch. Less than 30 minutes later, the sheriff arrived quickly. I stepped outside to talk with him alongside Bill, explaining what had happened. I suggested we bring the smaller rustler out first for the sheriff to speak with. He agreed, and I soon had my prisoner ready outside. It was clear that he was scared, and at first he refused to talk. "Bill, it sounds like we only have a simple case of trespassing. It seems a waste of my time to handle it. I could just leave and let you deal with it," the sheriff said. The smaller rustler's eyes went wide with fear, and he began to speak. The sheriff quickly got the truth from him, called for backup, and soon sheriff vehicles were arriving at Wilson's ranch. The rustler had told them where to look for the stolen cattle. They found almost 100 cattle branded with the Rocking Bee. By the end of the day, Wilson and his men were in custody. After all the excitement, it was past 9 when we finally sat down for dinner. Caitlin was at the table but kept her gaze on her plate. "What were you doing up there?" Bill asked her, since he hadn't had a chance to speak to her earlier. "I was just swimming. I didn't think anyone would try to sneak up on me," she said, giving me a sharp look. "First of all, Caitlin," I replied, "I wasn't spying. I followed the tracks of their horses to the stream. And second, what do you think would have happened if I hadn't been there? I don't think those 3 guys were planning to have a nice time when they saw you swimming in the pool." Caitlin's face turned bright red. "Thank goodness you arrived when you did, Carson," Colleen said. "I hate to think what could have happened." Everyone dropped the topic, and we hurriedly ate. We still needed to get up early the next day. I left the kitchen for my cabin and was halfway there when Caitlin called out to me. I stopped and waited for her. "So, did you enjoy the view today?" she snapped at me. I guess it was too much to hope she might actually be thankful. "Let's just say it was quite something to see." Caitlin let out a frustrated sound and turned to stomp away towards the house. I shook my head. It seemed something about me bothered her. The next day, Bill had to go into town to officially report Wilson. It would take a few days to get the stolen cattle back to where they belonged. The prosecutor needed to handle everything first. Sam and I spent the day painting some of the outbuildings. We ate lunch in the kitchen, but Caitlin didn't join us, which was fine by me. Bill returned in the early afternoon, but waited until dinner to tell us what had happened. He explained that since this wasn't a serious crime, Wilson and his men would be let out on bail. He didn't think they would cause any trouble again, but we should stay careful. Bill looked over at Caitlin and smiled. "If you're going to swim like that again soon, you might want to take Carson along to keep an eye on you," he joked, teasing Caitlin. Caitlin's face turned bright red again, and she got up, kicking her chair back as she rushed from the room. Bill and Sam burst into laughter, and even Colleen giggled. I couldn't help but chuckle, too. Once everyone calmed down, we went back to eating. Bill wasn't finished teasing, though. I really want to thank you, Carson. Wilson could have put this ranch in a tough spot. You're worth every penny I pay you. We all shared another laugh at that. 3 days later, Bill got the news that he could get his cattle back. We loaded 3 horses into a trailer and drove to Wilson's main gate, marked as the Flying W Ranch. We had a sheriff's escort to where the missing cattle were gathered. Colleen came along to drive the truck and trailer back once we unloaded the horses. Bill, Sam, and I started to move the cattle back to his ranch. I felt like I was part of a Western movie on a cattle drive. As we approached the Rocking Bee Ranch, I went ahead and opened the fence so the cattle could cross over. Once all the cattle were back where they needed to be, we set up the fence again and rode back to the main house, feeling proud of our hard work. Caitlin had applied to become a licensed vet. This usually took about 45 days for approval, so in the meantime, she took care of the animals on her father's ranch. I would sometimes see her around or at mealtime. She still wasn't very friendly with me, but whenever I caught her eye, I would smile big and wiggle my eyebrows. This would usually make her blush. It was 2 weeks after the incident at the waterfall when we found ourselves in the barn together. "Been swimming lately?" I asked with a cheeky smile. Caitlin walked over, standing very close, and glared at me. "Why are you so annoying?" she shot back. I shrugged and smiled. "Why are you so mean?" I replied. She raised her hand as if to hit me, but I caught her wrist before she could. Then she tried with her other hand, and again I caught it. I held both her hands behind her back, bringing her closer to me. I leaned in slightly, stopping when our faces were just an inch apart. Caitlin looked surprised, but she didn't pull away. "If you were with me, I'd have a good talking to you," I whispered. Caitlin gasped loudly. "You wouldn't dare!" she said, trying to pull away. I let go of her and she stumbled back onto the ground. "It's not that I wouldn't dare. I just ended things with someone who didn't care about me, and I'm not looking to start with someone else." Up to now, it had always been Caitlin who walked away. This time I turned and left the barn, leaving her sitting there, surprised. I didn't see her again until dinner. She didn't say anything, but I noticed her looking at me in a way I couldn't quite understand. Not that I ever claimed to figure out women anyway. My marriage to Janice showed that. The next day, I was in the barn cleaning out the stalls when Bill came in. It was Sunday, his day off, so I knew he wasn't there to work. He probably wanted to talk. I wondered if Caitlin had told him about yesterday and if he was going to ask me to stay away. I paused my work as he came over. "I hear you and Caitlin had a bit of a clash yesterday," he said. So she had filled him in. But I noticed a glint in Bill's eyes. "Yeah, you could say that. It was probably mostly my fault," I admitted. "Maybe, maybe not. I think her issue is that she doesn't know what to make of you. At first, she thought you were only around for a reason. You become the hero who rescued her and the ranch. What she can't understand is why you don't seem to follow her like the other local guys. Caitlin, just like her mother when she was young, is used to having the boys wanting her attention. She has had a few boyfriends, but none of them lasted long. It seems she didn't really respect them. I just hope you don't let her push you away. In my opinion, you're welcome to stay here as long as you like." "Thanks, Bill. That really means a lot to me. As for Caitlin, I'll stop teasing her and hopefully we can just get along," I replied. Bill left the barn, and I continued my work. I had all day to think about what he said. If Caitlin was really interested in knowing me, she should just talk to me. I wasn't going to chase after her like the others. Caitlin didn't join us for dinner that night, but no one brought it up, and I didn't ask. The next morning I woke up at 5, as usual, even though it was my day off. Sticking to my routine felt easier, so I never slept late. I had breakfast, and after Sam and Bill went to work, I went to get my laundry. Bill had bought a big washer and dryer so I could do all my clothes in one go. The laundry room was next to the kitchen, so while my clothes washed, I sat at the kitchen table and enjoyed some coffee. Colleen and I were talking at the table when Caitlin walked in. She rarely had breakfast with us and usually ate later. "Do you have any plans for today?" Colleen asked me. "Actually, I was thinking of driving into town. Is there anything you'd like me to pick up?" I asked her. "Well, if you wouldn't mind, there are a few things I need," she replied. "I'd be happy to help," I said. "Could I ride into town with you?" Caitlin asked unexpectedly. I looked up in surprise. I was going to go to the general store for a few things, and it seems wasteful for us both to drive, she explained as if she needed to justify her request. Sure, I'd be glad to give you a ride, I responded, still surprised. After yesterday, I hadn't expected her to want to ride anywhere with me. I'll be leaving in about an hour and a half after I finish my laundry. Okay, I'll be ready, Caitlin said. She finished making herself something to eat and sat at the table, quietly listening while Colleen and I chatted. Caitlin must have been waiting for me because as soon as I stepped out of my cabin, she came out the back door. She looked wonderful in a turquoise sundress that matched her red hair. The straps of her dress left her arms and shoulders bare. Her skin was smooth, and unlike many others with red hair, neither Caitlin nor her mother had freckles. She moved with grace as she walked toward me, her sparkling blue eyes focused on me, as if she wanted to make sure I noticed her. I opened the passenger side door for her and watched as she settled in. We started driving, and for the first part of the trip she was quiet, looking at the countryside. I thought you were going to kiss me yesterday, she said suddenly. I turned to look at her, but she was focused on the window. Well, that might have been nice, but I have a rule about not pushing my feelings on someone who isn't interested. I caught a glimpse of her looking at me. Caitlin stayed quiet but frequently glanced my way. I stopped at the general store where I needed to buy some new jeans and shirts. Caitlin had a list of things her mom wanted, and after an hour we had everything packed. Next, I needed to go to the hardware store to get a few things for Bill, but it was lunchtime and I was getting hungry. I suggested we stop to eat, and Caitlin agreed. I pulled into the diner where I had first met Bill and Colleen. We sat across from each other and ordered our meals. Once again, we sat in silence, and I started to think I should have gone to the hardware store first. Just then, the door opened, and 3 men walked in. I recognized 2 as guys who had been interested in Caitlin. They headed straight for our table, with 2 of them taking seats next to her while the 3rd stood behind me. They ignored me and began chatting with Caitlin. I stood up and told the 3rd guy to sit down. I could see Caitlin's annoyed look as I moved to another table. I signaled the waitress when she brought our food and asked her to place mine in front of me. I quickly ate, ignoring the noise from Caitlin's table. I paid for our meals, leaving some cash on the table, and stood up. Caitlin barely touched her food. Her plate was still full. I'm going to head to the hardware store. I can come back later to see if you're ready, I said, interrupting their chat. Caitlin pushed her plate away and stood up. No, I'll go with you. It was nice seeing you guys again, but we have to go, she said. The guys protested, with one even offering her a ride home, but she declined and followed me outside to my SUV. I drove to the hardware store while she remained in the vehicle looking quite upset. The mood didn't change as we drove back to the ranch and turned onto the long driveway. Why did you do that? She asked. Do what? I replied, not sure what she meant. Get up and move to the other table. Oh, that. I thought you'd rather be with your friends. Plus, I didn't want to get caught up in whatever they were trying to win from you. You are really frustrating, she said sharply. I chose to stay silent. I didn't want to argue with her while I was driving. When we arrived at the house, Caitlin quickly grabbed what she could from the back of the SUV. I followed behind with the rest of the bags as she hurried inside. She dumped everything on the kitchen table without saying a word and walked out of the room. Colleen, her mother, glanced at me with a questioning look. I shrugged and said, I guess I'm the bad guy here. Colleen chuckled and placed a gentle hand on my arm. I've never seen anyone get under Caitlin's skin like you do, she said softly. Maybe that's just what I'm good at, I replied. I'm not sure that's the only thing, she responded, leaving me a little puzzled. I decided to head back to my cabin and put away the new clothes I had bought. Not wanting to stay indoors, I went to the barn, saddled a horse, and rode out to clear my head. Eventually, I found myself at the top of the waterfall. It was a peaceful day, so I tied the horse to a tree and sat by the edge, looking down at the clear water below. I'd been sitting there for a while when Caitlin appeared, riding her horse below. She got off, and not wanting her to think I was spying, I tossed a rock into the water, making a splash. She looked up and spotted me. Instead of riding away, she came up to where I was sitting. She tied her horse next to mine and walked over to me. I stood up and moved away from the edge, unsure of what she had in mind. You're so frustrating, she said, stopping just inches from me. And you're still difficult, I replied. But this time, instead of arguing, I impulsively pulled her into a kiss. After a moment, I let her go and turned to leave, but she grabbed my arm and pulled me back. I was surprised when she kissed me again, and this time there was no hesitation. Our emotions took over, and for a moment we were lost in the intensity of it. Afterward, we both stood there, catching our breath, unsure of what to say next. The tension between us hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. Neither of us spoke, but the silence seemed to say more than words could. Our breathing gradually slowed down, and we continued to hold each other. "Am I really difficult?" she asked quietly. I chuckled softly. "You definitely have your moments." "I'm sorry," she replied shyly. I looked at the spirited redhead and wondered if I had managed to understand her better. I thought of Bill and Colleen and the love they had. I briefly envisioned a similar life with Caitlin. "Let's go for a swim," Caitlin suggested. I nodded and we collected our clothes before leading our horses down to the pool. I watched her as she walked ahead and stepped into the cool water. We waded in until the water reached our chests, and Caitlin moved into my arms. She wrapped her legs around my waist, and we shared another sweet kiss. I felt a rush of warmth as we connected again, moving slowly together. The water mixed with the moment, and our lips stayed connected as we enjoyed each other's presence. I held her close, feeling her shiver in my arms. The water kept me steady on my feet. Caitlin rested her head against my shoulder, and I held her until we were forced out by the cold. We dressed silently and rode our horses back down together. After we put our horses away, Caitlin came to me and wrapped her arms around my neck, kissing me once more. Without saying a word, she turned and headed to the main house. I walked back to my cabin in a daze and slipped into the shower. The warm water flowed over me as I reflected on what had just happened. I realized I had stronger feelings for this wonderful woman than I had acknowledged before. I had just enough time to get ready for dinner. When I entered the kitchen, Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already sitting there, but Caitlin was nowhere in sight. We had just sat down when she walked in. Surprisingly, instead of sitting next to Sam, she chose to sit next to me. Bill and Colleen exchanged curious glances, but Caitlin simply smiled at them. During dinner, Caitlin chatted enthusiastically. Despite her parents' curiosity, they didn't ask why she seemed so happy. After the meal, Caitlin helped her mother with the dishes while Sam and I returned to our cabins. I had just slipped under the covers when I heard a soft knock on my door. Wearing only my boxers, I opened the door to find Caitlin waiting for me. We shared a gentle kiss, and she joined me in bed after changing. We shared a tender moment before drifting off to sleep in each other's arms. Morning came too soon, and I reached over to turn off the alarm. Caitlin was still curled up next to me, letting out a small noise as the sound interrupted our peace. With great effort, I finally pulled myself out of bed. I turned on the light in the bathroom and got ready for the day. I walked over and gave Caitlin a gentle kiss on her head before leaving the cabin. During breakfast, I noticed the curious looks from Bill and Colleen. I wondered if they knew where their daughter had spent the night. After breakfast, I went outside to prepare the pickup for another day of setting fence posts. Working alone on the ranch gave me plenty of time to think. I was shocked that just 3 months had passed since I left my wife. It felt like a lifetime. I thought about Bill, Colleen, and Sam and how much they meant to me. Then I thought about Caitlin and our special moments from the day before. I wondered if I had found a love like what her parents had. At lunch, I realized I had forgotten my meal again. Just then, I heard a pickup speeding toward me. It skidded to a stop and Caitlin jumped out, running to me with a bag in her hand. She hugged me tightly. "Mom said you forgot your lunch," she said with a giggle. I didn't care about lunch anymore. I pulled her close for another sweet kiss. I didn't manage to set as many fence posts that day as usual, but I enjoyed my time with Caitlin. We talked a lot. I shared stories about my past life and how it hadn't gone well. Caitlin expressed her worry that I might leave. "Caitlin, I won't leave unless you ask me to go," I told her. After a while, Caitlin returned home and I finished my workday. I went back to my cabin to shower and change. That evening, she was in the kitchen when I arrived, and she chose the seat next to me. Halfway through our meal, there was a knock at the door and Bill went to check. He returned with a young man who had shown interest in Caitlin before. Caitlin stayed seated and looked at him. "I was wondering if you would like to go for a drive," he asked. In our area, going for a drive often meant going on a date. "I appreciate it," Caitlin replied, "but I don't think my boyfriend would like it." She leaned over and gave me a kiss on the cheek. The young man turned red and left the house. It was clear now. I looked at Bill and Colleen and saw they were smiling, and even Sam was grinning. We were officially a couple. After a few days, no other local men came to visit Caitlin. She made it clear she wasn't interested. I found a way to help Caitlin. She was trying to get a loan from the bank to buy the equipment she needed to start her veterinarian business. The bank would not give her an unsecured loan, and the only way for her to get it was to ask her father to risk the ranch as security. She did not want to do that. I told her to give me a few days because I might have another idea. I contacted my bank overseas and set up an account in the name of a fake loan company. I had Caitlin fill out a loan application on my computer and send it online. I made it so the application came to my email. After a couple of days, I sent her a message saying her loan was approved and the money would be transferred to her account. Caitlin was thrilled to hear the news, but asked why the loan only had a 2% interest rate. I explained that the group was a non-profit organization that helped people they believed would do good things for the community. I could have simply given her the money, but I knew she was proud and would not accept it. She had worked hard to earn her degree and wanted to succeed on her own. By the time her license was approved, she had bought a new van and turned it into a traveling veterinary office with the right equipment. Once people knew she was licensed, many local ranchers began to call her for help. Caitlin spent many nights with me in my cabin. Bill and Colleen knew about it but seemed to have no problem with it. At 27, she was old enough to make her own choices. It took 3 months for Wilson and his workers to go to trial. The case was straightforward. One of his workers agreed to testify against him and received 2 years of probation. The other 5 workers got 5 years in prison each. Wilson, as the main person behind the theft, was given the maximum sentence of 10 years and a fine of $50,000. When they took Wilson to prison, I started to investigate him and his ranch. He was single and had no family nearby. With all his workers in prison, no one was left to run the ranch. That's when I came up with a new plan. But first, I needed to wrap up some old business. I had to get a divorce, but I did not want Janice to get half of my money. To handle this, I asked my friend Jake for help again. Instead of emailing, I called him. I asked him to talk to Janice and tell her that I wanted to offer her a settlement for the divorce. The offer was a flat $50,000. If she refused, she would never hear from me again and would get nothing. She tried to act surprised and asked why I had left and why I wouldn't come home. That changed when Jake told her I knew about her and her boyfriend Brandon and her plan to leave me. Janice realized her game was over. She was still working as a waitress and finding it hard to make ends meet, so she agreed to my offer. To set this up, I needed to go back to Texas and hire a lawyer to prepare some documents. Caitlin was not happy when I told her I was going. I explained that I needed to finish that part of my life and promised her I would come back. I had planned to drive to the airport and leave my car in long-term parking, but she insisted on driving me and wanted to be there when I returned. I think the fact that I was leaving my SUV and most of my things, except for what I could fit in one suitcase, made her feel a bit better. I left on Sunday and Jake picked me up at the airport when I got there. I stayed with him, his wife, and their 2 kids. Of course, I called Caitlin every night. By Friday, I had taken care of all the paperwork. Jake took Janice to my lawyer. It was explained to her that she would receive a check for $10,000 now and the remaining $40,000 in 60 days once the divorce was finalized. My lawyer showed her the check he would hold until the judge made the final decision. She signed the documents, and my lawyer gave her the $10,000. I didn't have to see Janice. I then thought about the items I had in storage. There were keepsakes and valuable things from my parents, as well as yearbooks and other memories I wanted to keep. I decided I didn't want to come back for them later, so I rented a moving van and loaded it up. Caitlin was really surprised when I told her I wasn't flying back. I had to calm her down, and when I explained that I was bringing back everything that mattered to me, she got excited about my return. It took me 3 days of driving hard to cover the 1,600 miles. I arrived at the Rocking Bee Ranch on Tuesday evening. I received a warm welcome from everyone. That night, Caitlin kept celebrating my return until early morning when we fell asleep from exhaustion. I was ready to put my plans in motion. This involved making several trips to the prison where Wilson was held. I wanted to buy his ranch. At first he wouldn't agree, but I kept explaining my points. He would be in prison for at least 7 years, and with good behavior, he would only then be eligible for parole. He had no one to manage his ranch, and by the time he got out, his home and buildings might be in poor shape. His cattle would likely die without anyone to care for them in the winter. I asked him if he thought he would be welcomed back after everything that happened. This was ranching country, and people didn't look kindly on someone who had trouble with the law. When he realized he faced losing everything, he accepted my offer. At least this way, he would have something to start fresh with when he was released. Next, I needed to find the money to proceed. I moved my funds back into the country, knowing that Janice wouldn't risk her $40,000 by doing anything foolish. In the end, I got Wilson to agree to a price of $5 million. It was worth a lot more than I thought, so finding funding was easy. I put down $500,000 and got a loan for the rest. It took me a month to get everything settled. I had kept my plans a secret from everyone. It was tough, but I told Caitlin and Bill that I had some personal matters to handle. It really only took me a day or two each week. I set myself up as a business and registered the land under that name. Summer had ended and fall was beginning. I hired someone to harvest the hay on the land and brought on 4 workers to live on the property and take care of things for now. The most skilled worker became the temporary foreman. I told him that I would be away for a while, but I would stay close by. He could always reach me by phone, and I would visit the ranch often. I also planned to remodel the main house. It was a 2-story, 5-bedroom house that needed some updates. Even though Caitlin was getting a bit frustrated because I wouldn't share what I was doing, our relationship kept growing. I knew my feelings for her deepened each day, and I felt she felt the same way. Her work as a veterinarian was going well, though it meant she had to be on the road a lot. Still, she was happy. There was a moment when I almost told her everything. I had just returned from checking on the remodeling when she confronted me. "What's going on, Carson? Are you involved with someone else?" she asked urgently. "Of course not. I swear there is no one else. I just have some things to take care of. Please trust me. I promise to share everything soon. I love you, Caitlin, and I need you to believe in me," I replied. Caitlin looked deeply into my eyes, searching for honesty, and then her expression softened. "All right, Carson. I trust you. But you better tell me what's happening soon, or I'll be very upset," she warned. I pulled her close and kissed her, filled with love. It was spring and the start of calving season when the renovations were finished. It was time for me to take the final step in my plan. One afternoon, I asked Caitlin to join me for a drive. "Dear, I think it's time for me to leave the Rocking Bee Ranch," I told her seriously. Instantly, tears filled her eyes. "But Carson, you promised you wouldn't leave," she said, her voice trembling. I had timed it so that we were at the former Flying W Ranch entrance. There was no sign above the gates at the moment. I turned in and drove down the private road. "I'm not planning on going far," I said, hoping to reassure her. Caitlin looked around, a bit confused. I wasn't sure if she had caught what I said. "Carson, why are we here on Wilson's land?" I waited to answer until we reached the main house. "Come on, I want to show you something." I got out of the truck, walked around, and opened her door. Taking her hand, I led her to the front door and opened it. "Carson," she whispered, "what are we doing? We could get in trouble." "Don't worry. Wilson doesn't own this place anymore. Let's explore. I want to hear what you think about the house." Caitlin looked at me, shaking her head, but she followed me inside. We went upstairs, walking through the bedrooms and then back down. There was a big living room, a nice den, 2 rooms set up for offices, and finally the kitchen. I saw her face light up at the sight of the new kitchen. Only 1 room had furniture, and that was the one I intended to use as my office. The rest of the rooms were waiting for her to decide what she wanted. "What do you think of the house?" I asked. "It's really nice," she replied. "Do you think you could live here?" "Carson, what is going on?" I could tell she was confused and a bit upset. I knelt down, reaching into my jacket pocket. "Caitlin, Wilson no longer owns this ranch. I do. I really want to know if you could live here. Would you consider living here as my wife?" "You own this?" she asked, her eyes wide. I nodded. "Yes. Then I pulled out the engagement ring and held it up. "Caitlin, I love you. Will you marry me?" Caitlin's face changed, and her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, I worried I had made a mistake until she jumped into my arms, showering me with kisses. "Yes, Carson, yes, I will marry you," she exclaimed. The next kiss was full of joy. Caitlin offered me her finger for the ring. She looked around the house, her excitement growing. She ran from room to room, taking everything in. I patiently waited until she came back into my embrace. "The house is beautiful. I love it," she said with enthusiasm. I led her to 2 doors in a hallway. "There are 2 offices, one for your business and one for me," I explained. I received another joyful kiss. I then took her to the office with the desk and showed her a large paper with a drawing of a property gate. At the top, it said, Double C Ranch. Caitlin studied it, her expression curious. "What does Double C mean?" she asked. "It stands for the Carson and Caitlin Ranch." I saw her eyes light up. "Oh my gosh, that's perfect!" she exclaimed. Once we had calmed down and dressed, I told Caitlin it was time to go tell her parents. She was so happy that she seemed to float out to the truck. We arrived a little after 6, and Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already in the kitchen for dinner. Caitlin and I walked in together, and she held up her left hand. "We're getting married!" she exclaimed. Colleen jumped up and rushed over to hug her daughter, while Bill and Sam came to shake my hand and pat me on the back. I received a big hug from my future mother-in-law, while Caitlin embraced her father and Sam. Once things settled down, we all sat down to eat. Caitlin waited until everyone had food. "Of course this means we will be moving," she said casually. "What?" Bill, Colleen, and Sam replied in shock. "Tell them, sweetheart," Caitlin said, looking at me. I nodded. "Well, Bill, you know how Wilson wanted to merge his ranch with yours? I thought it could be a good idea," I explained. Bill stood up, looking upset. "There is no way the Flying W is getting my ranch," he shouted. I laughed. "Bill, calm down. It's not the Flying W anymore. It's the Double C Ranch, and the new owners are right here at the table." "What are you talking about?" he asked, confused. "I bought out Wilson, and now Caitlin and I own the ranch," I clarified. "Double C Carson and Caitlin," Colleen said. She understood right away. "Bill, I thought if we combined the 2 ranches, you could run them. We would share the profits equally," I added. "But the Flying, Double C is much bigger than my ranch and makes a lot more money," he said. "Bill, you've done this your whole life. I need your help. I'd like us to be partners. You would run the operations and your decisions would be final. Plus, it's part Caitlin's ranch too. It keeps everything in the family," I explained. Bill sat back down and looked at Colleen. She nodded. Bill stretched his hand across the table to me and we shook on it. "This will take some getting used to, but I accept your offer." "This means we'll have more help, so Sam will be the head foreman," I said. Then I groaned. "And now I have to remove all those fence posts I worked so hard to put in on that side of the property." Everyone laughed. Dinner that night was a joyful celebration. Caitlin spent the night in my cabin and kept me busy. We were late for breakfast the next morning, but everyone was still in the kitchen when we came in. They waited for us so we could all drive over to the Double C, where Caitlin could show off her new home. Everyone was impressed, and I saw Colleen eye the newly renovated kitchen with interest. It took Caitlin and her mother a month to furnish the house. It was ready to move into on our wedding night. We got married at the Double C. Bill and his family were well respected, and ranchers and their families from far and wide came to celebrate our special day. As Caitlin's husband and Bill's son-in-law, I was welcomed into their community as the new owner of Double C Ranch. That night, after a long day, we went to bed. We spent the night together and a lot of the next day enjoying each other's company. But by the 3rd day of our marriage, I surprised my bride with a trip to Fiji for our honeymoon. Our first cattle roundup that year went well, and we sold a lot of cows at market. We made a good profit. Most of it helped pay off a loan, but thanks to Caitlin's business, we were doing well. We even built a new house for Sam, and he found a girlfriend who lives nearby. It looks like we might have another wedding soon. Another year has passed, and my wonderful wife just shared some amazing news with me. She's going to have a baby. We're on our way to tell the future grandparents right now. Before I go, I want to mention something. Some might say I should have learned my lesson from before and had Caitlin sign a prenuptial agreement. But if that's what you think, you don't really know Caitlin. She isn't like Janice. She works hard at her job and takes care of our home. She is just like her mother and shows me her love every single day. When I look into her beautiful blue eyes, I see that love shining back at me. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to Infidelity Plus to stay updated with more captivating tales of infidelity and payback. Turn on notifications so you're the first to see our latest content.